And we are live. Thank you, Professor Denning, for joining us today. As a reminder, I'm a ABPA patient, and I'm also helping the Aspergillosis Trusts in ensuring that people have the right information here. My guest today is Professor Denning, and I'm very happy about that. The reason is as follows. When I first got diagnosed with ABPA, I was seen by a consultant. And I realized that that consultant didn't really have that much understanding of the disease, and she would actually tell me that. So I did my own research on the internet, and it was very clear to me that all arrows were pointing at one particular place, which is South Manchester, and one particular person, which was Professor Denning. So, Professor Denning, explain me, like, what's your background? Like, how did you become such an important person in the aspergillosis story?
So I graduated in medicine in London at Guy's Hospital, and I trained in infectious diseases and pediatrics and in microbiology. I had some exposure to hematology, leukemia, bone marrow transplant patients as well. And later in my time, junior doctor training, I was told about a project related to aflatoxin, which is a mycotoxin produced by Aspergillus flavus, and it depresses the immune system, and it's consumed in low-income countries around the world. And my question was, did that affect why children weren't able to survive in serious infections like pneumonia and diarrhea and so on? So I did a little work on that. That was at Northwick Park Hospital. And during that time, I was interviewed for a fellowship in the US. I was successful in that fellowship, and then spent 3 years working with Dr. David Stevens at the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center and Stanford University. And Dr. Stevens was interested in antifungal treatments and had itraconazole on clinical trial when I arrived. And my first month looking after patients at the Stanford University Hospital, which was a very, very highly specialized hospital, we had 3 patients with invasive aspergillosis, and I put all 3 onto itraconazole, and all 3 responded. And that was the first time that anybody had developed and really seen responses to an oral medication for aspergillosis. And so with that experience, I then decided that because there was very little work in the area, Dr. Stevens himself had done very little work on this. There weren't any experts in America that I could find, or in Europe and so on, who focused on Aspergillus. So that's really what I decided to work on. And I did quite a lot of work over there on it. And then I was interviewed in Manchester in 1990 and came back to the first clinical academic position in Manchester in infectious diseases, primarily looking after patients with HIV and AIDS, actually. But over time, because of my interest in Aspergillus, I was referred patients with funny Aspergillus diseases. And one of the first of those was a man called Roger, who I then subsequently looked after for over 25 years, who had a cavity in his lung, which we didn't really fully understand, and actually became, we later understood it as chronic pulmonary aspergillosis, which was a terminology that we developed. And since that time, I've done a lot of other work. For example, some of the clinical trials with voriconazole, with micafungin, with caspofungin, and lots of work in the test tube testing susceptibility resistance to treatments. So those were the main sort of antecedents, if you like. And then it became, I moved then different hospitals in Manchester, and I ended up at Wythenshawe Hospital. And I started the month of 9/11, September 2011, and sorry, 2001. And I brought with me from North Manchester about 12 patients with aspergillosis, and it became obvious that the chest doctors also weren't very familiar with these diseases. So we had set up a laboratory which was based at Hope Hospital. We moved that to Wythenshawe Hospital. That became the Mycology Reference Centre. And we gradually started to see more and more patients, because I was part of the respiratory group there, and they would send me challenging patients with Aspergillus tests positive or culture positive or funny x-rays. And we gradually built a cohort of patients. And then that became, after we made an application in 2008, the National Aspergillosis Centre in 2009. So that's the basic background to it. I think from a career perspective, I was fortunate to be in a space where there were not very many other people working in this area, and there were new drugs coming through. So itraconazole was the first, then voriconazole, then the echinocandins, posaconazole came through, and then later, of course, isavuconazole. And so that provided real drive to really understand these diseases and studied them. Having said that, the amount of work on chronic pulmonary aspergillosis and ABPA with the new drugs has been relatively limited. Most of that work has been done with invasive aspergillosis, which is where the, if you like, the greatest need was, because those patients were dying of the disease relatively rapidly, whereas patients with chronic and allergic disease could die, but it was more of a chronic indolent illness than an acute illness.
So when you started in Stanford, what was the state of the literature? Like, was this well understood, aspergillosis, or was this? I think you mentioned that the treatment with itraconazole, etc., was pretty new, but was the disease, the group of diseases, was this well understood, or what was the status then?
The people really did understand invasive aspergillosis in leukemia and transplant patients. That was clear. There was much less work on invasive aspergillosis in intensive care, and in fact, there'd been very little done in patients with, for example, influenza, which was really only exemplified about 7 years ago. The literature on chronic pulmonary aspergillosis was really focused on fungal balls and aspergilloma, and the literature there was pretty poor. It's almost all surgical literature. There had been no work with amphotericin for those patients at all. And after I got back to Manchester, there was a little bit of work published on itraconazole for chronic pulmonary aspergillosis, but not much. But the terminology wasn't there, so nobody had described chronic fibrosing pulmonary aspergillosis. They hadn't used the term chronic cavitary pulmonary aspergillosis. There was no description of Aspergillus nodules. And on the allergic side, ABPA was recognized and documented in asthma patients and cystic fibrosis patients. The criteria for diagnosis were not very well exemplified, and the tests weren't properly studied, but the disease entity was understood. But what wasn't understood was fungal allergy in the context of asthma, which was driving severe asthma, which we named SAFs, or severe fungal sensitization, subsequently. In fact, I'm not sure if that's the best term, because actually I'm not sure whether it's the sensitization or ongoing infection which is driving the severe asthma, but the linkage is clearly there. And then it was only during the time when we had the National Aspergillosis Centre, we saw patients that we described for the first time Aspergillus bronchitis, which was another entity which had been, there were odd case reports and literature, but basically this disease had not been described until the 2000s. So it really was there has been a big change in thinking about the disease over that 25 or so 30 years. So
for getting back to your days in Stanford, you said that, so you run essentially trials on, this is it here, the wonder drug.
Yes.
This is actually, like, for many people, this, like for myself, I actually lead a very, relatively normal life. And this is, due to this. There's no doubt about this. So tell me a bit, how did these, trials, if I may call it, because I'm not a scientist, but how does that work? Yes. Why did you choose that drug? And did you do the publishing of these trials?
Yeah. So the itraconazole was developed by Janssen Pharmaceutical in Belgium, and which is under the Johnson & Johnson umbrella. The first patients were treated in late 1995. I arrived on the scene in Stanford in the middle of 1997. And I think we had enrolled, or David Stevens had enrolled about 8 patients or something with various forms of aspergillosis over a year and a half. And I pushed that up a lot with these 3 patients and then multiple other patients. And as a result of that experience, which we did write up at that stage, it was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Dr. Stevens put forward a proposal for the mycosis study group in the US to do a multi-center study of itraconazole therapy for these patients. And that proceeded, and we wrote that up, and it was finally published in 1994. But the patients in that study, which I had analyzed by the time I'd left, actually, in about 1991, formed the basis for registration of itraconazole as a new drug in the US and in Europe and in other parts of the world as well. And while I was there, we also recruited 6 patients with ABPA. 3 of them had cystic fibrosis and 3 had other forms of ABPA, and 5 of those 6 patients responded. And so that was the first time, apart from 1 or 2 other observations in Europe, that ABPA was successfully treated with an oral antifungal. And that led Dr. Stevens to develop a randomized control study of ABPA versus placebo, which he then proceeded to do over the following 6 years or so. And he published that in the New England Journal of Medicine as well. And so that led to the much greater usage of this drug in ABPA patients.
What happened? It sounds like what you're telling me is that Stanford was on the case. Like they had research, things were happening. But if you look now in 23 or the last couple of years, I haven't heard anything coming from Stanford. And I'm not in the business, of course. Like I vaguely try to decipher the scientific journals, but have they? I see more research coming from the Manchester team or Imperial or so forth. Is that something that you've observed as well? Do we just have more interest in the topic, or?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I took my interest and really focused it on aspergillosis. Dr. Stevens' primary interest was actually in an American fungus called coccidioidomycosis, and that was what he was quite expert in, and itraconazole works for that too. So there have been centers in the US that have done work on aspergillosis, but there aren't very many of them. There's a maybe 10 or something like that. Stanford itself, you're right, there's not really a fungal expert there. There's a lot of treatment of fungal disease, but there wasn't that much. The other thing that shifted the work over to Europe was Pfizer's decision with voriconazole to only do their phase 2 studies in Europe. So they didn't use the drug at all in the US until they had shown that it worked in Europe. So we enrolled around 120 patients with invasive aspergillosis across Europe, and about another 60 with chronic forms of aspergillosis, again across Europe. And those 2 studies, which were published, formed the basis of the randomized study, which was done actually across the world in 90 centers, including the US, and involved a lot of US investigators. But Europe has been the much bigger driver generally for work in aspergillosis than the US. We don't have very much histoplasmosis. We have no coccidioidomycosis. We don't have blastomycosis in Europe. So we don't have as many fungi as they have in America. So we can focus on Aspergillus and Candida a bit more, which is what we've tended to do.
Okay. And then, so in the process, you became professor at Manchester University, well deserved. And you, so the Wythenshawe Clinic, and this is where I don't really understand how the NHS works, but the Wythenshawe, like your clinic, if I may call it so, became a National Aspergillosis Center. How did that work?
So we had to make an application to the a small committee within the Department of Health for a highly specialized service. So there are several other highly specialized services. All the transplant services are highly specialized services. Some of the services for genetic disorders like epidermolysis bullosa and certain other genetics, they're highly specialized services. Chronic pulmonary aspergillosis was a little unusual, and the criteria were that it was a rare disease, and that the drugs were very expensive, and that it was complicated to manage. And so CPA fulfilled those criteria well, because we thought there were probably less than 1,000 patients nationally at that time. Now we think there might be 2,000 or 3,000, but it's not, it's not hundreds of thousands of people with CPA. The drugs were very expensive, 20,000 a year, 30,000 a year for voriconazole, and then posaconazole following it. And the IVs with amphotericin, micafungin, also very expensive. And then the management is complicated because you've got some patients needing surgery, you've got complex radiology to handle, you've got sophisticated laboratory work to be done, and the cost of that was considerable. So they allocated this highly specialized service to Wythenshawe Hospital, which was its own NHS trust at that time. We then renamed it the National Aspergillosis Centre because we wanted to give it a sense that there was the only one in the country, which I think was the right thing to do. I was accompanied in terms of clinical care by William Hope, who you may have met there, who's now a professor in Liverpool, working mostly in pharmacology. And then Dr. Pippa Newton joined as a consultant shortly after we set up the centre. And then since then, many other people have joined. And we reinforced the laboratory with appointment of Professor Malcolm Richardson and his wife, Rena Richardson, who now runs the laboratory over there. And in the budget, we had various clinical fellows, financial slots. So various other people came through and trained in this topic area. And one of those was Caroline Baxter, who's now leads the centre as my successor. So it was and still is actually almost unique, and in being the only highly specialised centre, single centre in Manchester, and also the only one which is in infectious diseases and in pulmonary medicine, actually, because of the confluence of those two topics. And it does, one of the observations in general about advances in medicine, and I think it's true in other areas, is that people who tend to make advances working at the edge of their specialty. They're working at the edge of their discipline. So I was working at the edge of infectious diseases and the edge of pulmonary medicine, and it was that combination that enabled real progress to get made in the topic area.
Do you know on the top of your head how many patients you've sort of managed in the NAC for the last?
We started with, the first year we had about 40 new CPA patients, and then once it got better known, we ended up with around 120, 130 new referrals a year up until the time that I left in 2020. But we would have nearly double that of patients with other Asperger's diseases like ABPA, bronchitis, invasive aspergillosis, even difficult nail infections, difficult ear infections, and things like that. So we would typically be referred a little bit more than 300 new Asperger's cases a year from across the country, with a strong predominance in the Northwest, I should say. At least half the patients came from the Northwest. But if you put a stake in the middle of Manchester and go 50 miles around, you get to 11 million people. So there are a lot of people in the Northwest. So that's reasonable for that to be the case.
I thank you so much for the background on your your career and the Manchester research. I think on behalf of many people, I'd like to thank you. I think you can honestly say that you had an enormous impact on many lives. I've seen that myself. I know a lot of people who were treated in the NAC, and people like myself who, like, I felt the difference. It was very obvious that before, the treatment wasn't quite right, and here I am now, like I don't know, 20 years after I was first or 15 after I was first in Manchester. Yeah, leading a normal life thanks to the care of you and your team. So thank you very much for that, Professor Denning.
You're welcome, and thank you for saying that. I think, I mean, you know, one of the things one sets out in life to do is to make a difference, and I'm glad that it has made a difference in this.
You definitely have done that. Thank you very much. So that's